You're listening to the Sex Addicts Recovery Podcast, a place for sex addicts to share their experiences of recovery, to help break the stigma, myths, and misconceptions of sex addiction. This podcast may contain topics of sexuality, sexual trauma, dysfunction, or other things that may be triggering, so listener discretion is advised. Hello, and welcome to the Sex Addicts Recovery Podcast. My name is Jason, I'm a sex addict, and I will be your podcast host for today. Hey, what's going on, everyone? Welcome to episode 121 of the Sex Addicts Recovery Podcast. This week, we'll be continuing our journey with Joe and Charlie, talking about the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, and this time we'll be covering Chapter 4, We Agnostics. And as I have mentioned on previous Joe and Charlie episodes, they were AA historians speaking a lot at AA conventions and other things around the country. And this comes from their recordings called The Big Book Comes Alive. At many of our meetings, we use the reading called How It Works. And this is adapted from Chapter 5 of the Big Book called How It Works. There's some introductory paragraphs, then the reading of the 12 steps, and a few closing paragraphs. And hearing this so many times at meetings, before reading the big book, I had no idea what the ending was all about. And so I did want to read those last few paragraphs that we have been able to adapt for SAA. And this is straight out of the big book on page 60, right after the 12 steps. Many of us exclaimed, "What an order! I can't go through with it." Do not be discouraged. No one among us has been able to maintain anything like perfect adherence to these principles. We are not saints. The point is that we are willing to grow along spiritual lines. The principles we have set down are guides to progress. We claim spiritual progress rather than spiritual perfection. Our description of the alcoholic, the chapter to the agnostic, and our personal adventures before and after make clear three pertinent ideas. A, that we were alcoholic and could not manage our own lives. B, that probably no human power could have relieved our alcoholism. And C, that God could and would if he were sought. So many other 12-step programs have adapted this for their own readings. And I wanted to read the adaptation that we have for Sex Addicts Anonymous that we read in a lot of the meetings that I go to. It's basically the last part that was changed. Our description of the addict, the chapter to the agnostic, and our personal adventures before and after make clear three pertinent ideas. A, that we were sex addicts and could not manage our own lives. B, that probably no human power could have relieved our addiction. And C, that God could and would if God were sought. So we did make a few changes there. Some meetings are now moving away from reading adapted material from the Big Book of AA and finding readings from the Green Book. The reason I wanted to focus in on this adaptation is that last little section, our description of the addict, the chapter to the agnostic, and our personal adventures before and after make clear three pertinent ideas. I did not understand exactly what that meant, reading it meeting after meeting after meeting, until I read the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. So our description of the alcoholic is from the chapter More About Alcoholism. The chapter to the agnostic is chapter 4, which Joe and Charlie will be discussing in this episode, We Agnostics. And then our personal adventures before and after. Those are the basic stories. So when I finally got to read chapter 4, We Agnostics, when I was working on step 2 for the first time, it dawned on me, oh, this was what was meant in that reading. And so that's why I wanted to read it here at the beginning of this episode. So before turning it over to the recording from Joe and Charlie, The Big Book Comes Alive, I have chosen to skip over their section on chapter 3, More About Alcoholism. Most of the stories in that do describe the unmanageability around alcohol. So as Joe and Charlie talk about the big book, they start to flow out of one chapter and into the next. And so there was a really good spot in there where they started closing out the chapter on more about alcoholism and talking about the various examples of powerlessness and the inability to stop addictive behavior on their own. And in more about alcoholism, I believe on the last episode that we did on chapter 2, I did read about the jaywalker. So there is the story of a man of 30, the story of Jim, the story of the jaywalker, and the story of Fred. And so they're just segueing out of those various stories before closing out the chapter, and then they pick up where chapter 4 begins. And similarly, at the end of this recording was right when they were finishing out chapter 4 and segueing it into chapter 5, how it works. So where I chose to stop the recording, we'll pick up from there as we talk about step 3 in the beginning section of how it works. And that episode will be coming out in about a month or so. So with all that out of the way, here's Joe and Charlie from The Big Book Comes Alive, segueing out of chapter 3, more about alcoholism, into chapter 4, We Agnostics, and covering step 2. I hope you enjoy it.
Let's go to page 43. Last paragraph.
And he said, once more. Now, he's only told us about 6 or 7 times, okay? That's the way you talk to drunks. You tell them about 6 or 7 times, then you tell them once more. You see, he told us through Bill's story that you can't stay sober on self-knowledge. On Roland's story that you can't stay sober on self-knowledge. Jim's story, you can't stay sober on self-knowledge. Jaywalker's story, you can't keep from jaywalking on self-knowledge. Fred's story, self-knowledge. So once more, he tells us, the alcoholic at certain times has no effective mental defense against the first drink, except in a few rare cases. Neither he nor any other human being can provide such a defense. His defense must come from a higher power. Can't heal a sick mind with a sick mind. Can't think your way out of it. Self-knowledge won't get it. Just won't do it.
At the end of this chapter now, he shut the door on me. He's let me see that if I don't find that power greater than human power because of the insanity of alcoholism, I'm going to go back to drinking again just as sure as anything. Now, whether I like the idea of the power greater than human power is beside the point. He's let me see here what's going to happen to me if I don't find that power. Now, if you're the kind of alcoholic that I am, and if you were raised in the church setting that I was raised in, then you would now find yourself in one hell of a dilemma. Because I fully realized at the end of this chapter that if I don't find this power, God as I understand Him, or whatever you want to call Him, and get that in my life, and I'm going to go back to drinking again. But I also fully understand, or understood at that time, I would be unable to find that power. Because you see, I was raised in a good old Southern Baptist church. Now, please don't get me wrong. I got nothing against the Southern Baptist church. It's a good church then, and it's a good church today. But when I was a kid going to that Southern Baptist church, I'm quite sure that once in a while they talked about a kind and a loving God. But if they did, that message never got to the pew that I sat in. Because all I remember hearing about God as a kid growing up in church was hellfire and brimstone. Going to hell for lying and cheating and stealing and drinking whiskey and committing adultery. By the time I got to AA, I'd been doing that for 26 years. And I knew God had already told St. Peter, when that little four-eyed sucker gets up here, send him downstairs. We'll not need his kind. I remember so clearly when I separated from God and I separated from the church. As a kid growing up in that church, they gave me the rules. They told me what I could do and what I couldn't do. They said, if you do this, this, and this, you'll be okay. If you do that, that, and that, you're going to hell just sure as anything. And I didn't have a bit of problem with that. until I got to be about 13 years old. And one day the minister looked me straight in the eye, and he said, to think about doing it is just as bad as doing it. And I said, oh, shit. I've had it now, because I'd been thinking about doing it for about 2 years. And I said to myself, well, if you're going to go to hell for thinking about doing it, then you just might as well go ahead and do it. And I did it. And I didn't go to hell immediately. And I said to myself, that sucker has been lying to me all along. And I made up my mind that day that that minister and my parents and my teachers had joined together in a conspiracy to keep me from having any fun. And I said, to hell with them. From this day on, I'm not going to pay any attention to what he says, what they say. From now on, I'm going to do it my way, the way I want to, and if they don't like it, to hell with them. And I walked away from church, and I walked away from God, and I was about 12, maybe 13 years old. When I come to AA, I was 38 years old the first day I walked in the door of AA, and I had the spiritual knowledge of a 12 or 13-year-old kid that was absolutely scared to death about God. And it would seem to for me to be able to find God in my life. For God to do anything good for me would be an impossible thing, period. Thank God Bill Wilson's a real alcoholic. Thank God he knew how I was going to feel when I got here. And thank God he knew that based on old ideas about God, it would be impossible for me to make a decision about this God thing. And I think he said to himself, is maybe I better give that guy a little more information. Maybe I better give him some new ideas about God so that he can discard some old ideas about God, and then maybe he can make a decision about this God thing. And he sat around and he wrote the next chapter, chapter 4, We Agnostics. I think it's one of the greatest pieces of spiritual information I've ever read in my life. Nowhere does this chapter try to prove to me there is any kind of God. Nowhere does it try to force this God thing on me. What it does do is give me some new ideas about God, things that I'd never heard before. And based on the new ideas, I was able to discard some old ideas. And then I was able to make a decision. And since that time, God has proven to me that there is a kind and a loving God. Thank God for this chapter, We Agnostics. Let's look at it for a few minutes.
I love the chapter, We Agnostics. It's opened up my mind to a point. See, what I've learned up to this point is I can't stay sober on my willpower. Tried that. The reason I can't stay sober on my willpower is the obsession of the mind is stronger than my will. There's only one thing stronger than the obsession of the mind, and that's He who made it. I'm getting right down to it now. Only God can remove the obsession of the mind, because you can't heal a sick mind with a sick mind. Only God can do that. And people like me with the spiritual knowledge of a 7-year-old boy, I had a real problem, because my understanding was that of a 7-year-old boy when I got here. Bill knew that we were going to feel that way. Because remember, he said when they talked to me about got my mind snapped shut against such theories, he knew we too were going to have those kind of problems. Our book says later on that when the spiritual malady is overcome, we straighten out physically and mentally. The word malady means illness, by the way. When the spiritual illness is overcome, see, I had a spiritual illness, a misunderstanding, 7-year-old boy understanding. I needed another understanding. And this chapter, We Agnostic, gives us another understanding. It's not in there to prove to us that there's a God or any particular type of religion. What it is in here for is for me to read and to study and ask questions of myself and with this book. What does that mean to me? What does that mean to me? Does that have any relevance to me? Can I understand that? Talk to other people about it. Get a better understanding. Well, how it happens is my mind opened up. and then God will prove to me that there's a God with an open mind. See, I never had any trouble with the idea about God. My trouble came from those people who were trying to tell me what their idea was and force it on me. That's where my trouble was. I resisted that, always did. The chapter We Agnostics, greatest piece of spiritual information that's ever been written, I suppose. It's there to open up our mind, and so God can prove to us that there's a God. And when that happens, then nobody could improve upon that, because we'll have a God of our own understanding that's just ours. The greatest piece of spiritual information, the chapter We Agnostic. Gnostic means knowledge, put the ag in front means without. Those of us who without knowledge, or at least the knowledge of a 7-year-old boy, I needed some different kind of knowledge. In the preceding chapters, you've learned something of alcoholism. We hope we make clear the distinction between the alcoholic and the non-alcoholic. If, when you honestly want to, you find you cannot quit entirely,
That's because of the obsession.
or if when drinking you have little control of the amount you take,
That's because of the allergy.
you're probably alcoholic.
We just love the simplicity of the big book. 2 little questions to determine if you're alcoholic. I use them all the time. People come to me today. They say, Charlie, you think I might be alcoholic? And I say, I don't know. Let me ask you a couple of questions. Have you been able to quit drinking entirely, left on your own resources? If they're a real alcoholic, they got to say no. And I say, do you have any control over the amount you drink after you once start drinking? If they're a real alcoholic, they got to say no. And I say, well, then you're probably an alcoholic. And it's just that simple. Okay, now the book says, if that be the case, you may be suffering from an illness, which only a spiritual experience will conquer. You know, we are very unique people. We're the only people in the world that have a 2-fold illness that can only be overcome by a spiritual experience. We probably number amongst a few people in the world that have a terminal illness, and we can come out of it in better shape than we went into it if we can have this spiritual experience. Now, to one who feels he's an atheist or agnostic, such an experience seems impossible. But to continue as he is means disaster, especially if he's an alcoholic of the hopeless variety. To be doomed to an alcoholic death,
Step 1.
or to live on a spiritual basis,
Step 2.
are not always easy alternatives to face, but it isn't so difficult. About half our original fellowship were of exactly that type. At first, some of us tried to avoid the issue, hoping against hope we were not true alcoholics. But after a while, we had to face the fact that we must find a spiritual basis of life or else. Perhaps it's going to be that way with you. But cheer up. Something like half of us thought we were atheists or agnostics, and our experience shows that you need not be disconcerted. And I think for me, right here, I had to stop. And I had to look at these words, atheist, agnostic, and what they really mean. Went to the dictionary and looked them up. And the dictionary defines as atheist as one who says there is no God, and even professes to be able to prove there's no God. Well, if the atheist really believes that, then they would have no power greater than human power to turn to. And they would have to stand on their own 2 feet and make their own decisions and run their own show. And a spiritual experience would seem to be an impossibility for them. I said, Charlie, are you an atheist? And I said, no, I'm not an atheist. Maybe you're an agnostic. And I looked up the word agnostic, and it's defined as one who believes there is a God, but acts as if he disbelieves. Stands on his own 2 feet, runs his own show, rules his own destiny, never turns to God for help, and he gets the same help from God that the atheist gets, which is nothing. I said, are you an agnostic? And I said, you bet your boots I am, because I've always believed in God. Ever since I left that church, I believed in God. But I had no knowledge of God because I never tried to use God in my life. I ran my own show. I ruled my own destiny, just like the atheist did, even though I believed there was a God. Today I believe the majority of the people coming to AA are agnostics. You know, I've never seen a true atheist in AA. Oh, I've seen some of them that profess to say there is no God, but they even believed in evolution. And if evolution isn't proof of some kind of power greater than human power, I don't know what is. I think most of us get here believing in God, but acting as if we disbelieve in God, and we don't turn to God for help. We don't turn to God for direction. We run and we rule our own show. And that's what got us in trouble. If a mere code of morals or a better philosophy of life were sufficient to overcome alcoholism, many of us would recover it long ago. We alcoholics are not drunken bums. Drunken bums are just about where they want to be. They're not too interested in changing the situation. We alcoholics have a set of morals. We have a philosophy of life. We will be there with the drunken bum, but we don't want to be there. That's the difference. And if our morals and if our philosophies would have saved us, many of us would have recovered a long time ago. But we found that such codes and philosophies did not save us, no matter how much we tried. We could wish to be moral. We could wish to be philosophically comforted. In fact, we could will these things with all our might, but the needed power wasn't there. Our human resources, now that's what the atheist and agnostic are, that's what they're running on. Our human resources, as marshaled by the will, were not sufficient. They failed utterly. Lack of power, that was our dilemma. And I'm sure that's absolutely true. If you and I could have found the power in any other way, we would not have become members of Alcoholics Anonymous. We're here because this is the court of last resort. Everything else we tried, none of it worked. I've never seen a newcomer come in AA yet and say, when I was 14 years old, I took a drink of alcohol and jumped up and down and shouted with joy and said I can hardly wait to be a member of AA when I'm 36. No, we came here because we had no other choice. If we could have found the power in any other way, we wouldn't be members of AA today. We had to find a power by which we could live. And it had to be a power greater than ourselves, obviously. But where and how were we to find this power? Well, that's exactly what this book is about. Its main object is to enable you to find a power greater than yourself, which will solve your problem. It doesn't say which will help you solve it, or which will enable you to solve it. It says which will solve your problem. And I find interestingly enough, from page 45 on, we don't talk about alcohol anymore. We're through talking about alcohol. From page 45 on, we talk about one thing and one thing only. For those of us who are powerless, and that's all of us, how do you find the power? And if we can find the power, then the power will solve the problem. Joe?
Let's go to page 46 for a moment. I had a little first sponsor. His name was George Gibbs, and George was a little black guy that I was in the Army with. Come into AA, he ends up being closer to me than my own family. George's dead now, but he taught me a lot about this idea right here. I told him, I said, George, I'm having a hard time with this God idea. He said, I know, I can tell that you are. He said, why don't you do some things that I have done? He read this to me. He said, yes, we have agnostic temper and had these thoughts and experience. Let's make haste to reassure you. We found that as soon as we were to lay aside prejudice and express even a willingness to believe in a power greater than ourselves, we commenced to get results. Even though it was impossible for us, any of us, to fully define or comprehend that power which is God. He said, go home tonight and get your pencil and a piece of paper out. Forget all that you think you know, those old ideas that you have. And if you could, realize you can't, but if you could, write down what you would want God to be. See, I didn't know you could do that. You go to hell in Oklahoma for doing that. You still will go to hell in Oklahoma for doing that.
Go to hell in a hurry, too.
But he gave me permission to do that. I must have needed a permission. So I went home that night and I wrote down some things that I would like God to be. I presented those to George, and he looked at them and he said, "That's good. You can start right there." See, I needed a starting point. And he gave it to me. Old ideas cast aside, new ones accepted. See, I didn't know you could do that. Much to our relief, we discovered we did not need to consider another's conception of God. Our own conception, however inadequate, was sufficient to make the approach and effect the contact with Him.
Here's another old idea cast aside. Because I was taught that you have to believe as they believe. And if you didn't believe as they believe, you're going to hell just sure as anything. And this book says that isn't necessarily true. We did not need to consider another's conception of God. Our own conception, however inadequate, was sufficient to make the approach and to effect a contact with Him. An old idea cast aside, a new idea takes its place. You let me have my own conception of God. Then that old hellfire and brimstone begins to disappear. And I begin to think just maybe, might be, a kind and a loving God that can help me out. Old idea cast aside, replaced with a new idea.
Many years ago, I went to a preacher, my wife's preacher at that time, to see if I could get back home. You know how we do, we like to do anything. So I went over and talked to this guy, and he looked at me and said, "Well, Joe, what seems to be your problem?" Well, I don't know what my problem is. So I told him what I thought it was, and it was her. And if you lived with her, you'd drink too, I told him. Well, them old Southern Baptist preachers will give you a solution to your problem. And he said, you must, and boy, did he emphasize that word must, you must have faith in these things. And he told me what they were. And I just looked at him. I got up and left. How can you have faith in something that you don't even believe? See, I had to come to believe. And this was the process. I didn't have any faith. I had to come to believe. And George gave me a way to come to believe. As soon as we admitted the possible existence of a creative intelligence, a spirit of the universe underlying the totality of things, we began to be possessed of a new sense of power and direction, provided we took other simple steps. We found that God does not make too hard a terms with those who seek Him. To us, the realm of spirit is broad, roomy, all-inclusive, never exclusive or forbidding to those who earnestly seek. It is open, we believe, to all men. I said, George, you mean I got to find God? And he said, Joe, God's not lost. He said, it's not in the finding, it's in the seeking. You follow me? It's not in the finding, it's in the seeking. And if I will seek God in my life, He will disclose Himself to me. It's in the seeking, it's not in the finding. Thank God I learned that one.
Another old idea cast aside. I was taught the way to God is a very straight and narrow path. And if you fall off of the other side of it, you're going to hell just sure as anything. And this thing says we found that God does not make too hard terms with those who seek Him. To us, the realm of the Spirit is broad and roomy. You know, it's not that straight and narrow path that I thought it was. It's not that rigid thing that I thought you had to be. He says it's all-inclusive, never exclusive or forbidding to those who earnestly seek. Another old idea cast aside. I was taught that if you didn't believe like they believed, there's no way that you could make it, that you're going to go to hell just sure as anything. And only those that believed as they believed were going to be able to go to the other good place. And this says that isn't necessarily true. It's all-inclusive, never exclusive or forbidding to those who earnestly seek. It is open, we believe, to all men. Some old ideas cast aside, replaced with some new ideas. My concept of God is already beginning to change. Page 47.
When therefore we speak to you of God, we mean your own conception of God. This applies too to other spiritual expressions which you find in this book. Do not let any prejudice.
Now, prejudice is old ideas.
you may have against spiritual terms deter you from honestly asking yourself what they mean to you. That's all we're doing, asking ourselves what these things mean to us. At the start, this was all we needed to commence spiritual growth, to effect our first conscious relation with God as we understood Him. And then afterward, we found ourselves accepting many things which then seemed entirely out of reach. That was growth. But if we wished to grow, we had to begin somewhere. So when we used our own conception, however limited it was, and certainly in my case it was very, very limited, but it was a starting place. It was a starting place. And I've been seeking God into my life ever since. And every year that goes by, my will changes, my life changes, and my understanding of God changes. It's an ongoing process. Never get to a point that I know it all in this area. I'm always seeking.
Now, to those of us who are seeking this relationship with God, you got to have a starting point. And this is where we start. We needed to ask ourselves but one short question. Do I now believe? The agnostic has always believed. Or am I even willing to believe? The atheist can become willing to believe that there is a power greater than myself. As soon as a man can say that he does believe, the agnostic, or is willing to believe, the atheist, we emphatically assure him that he's on his way. It has been repeatedly proven among us that upon this simple cornerstone, a wonderfully effective spiritual structure can be built. Asterisk, bottom of the page, please be sure to read Appendix 2 on spiritual experience. You see, the wonderfully effective spiritual structure that we're building is the spiritual experience. We don't have to wait to step 12 to get something out of it. We're in a process of building it now as we go through. Step 1, willingness, was the foundation of that structure. Step 2, believing, is the cornerstone of that structure. And later on, we're going to put some more stones in place as we build this structure. That was great news for us, for we'd assumed we could not make use of spiritual principles unless we accepted many things on faith which seemed difficult to believe. Now right here he separates the two words, faith and belief. Now one of the problems I always had as a kid in church is the minister always said, son, all you got to do is have faith and you'll be all right. Well, faith implies knowledge. Faith implies surety. Faith is after the fact information. I never had any faith that God would do for me what I couldn't do for myself. The best I can possibly do is to believe that God can do so. And then after certain things transpire and I receive God's power, then I'll know, and then I'll have faith. Let me give you a good example. Let's say that I moved into this Washington, D.C. area. And 2 or 3 months after I move in here, I've got a problem with my automobile. I don't know a good mechanic anywhere in this area, but you've lived here for years, and I'm pretty sure you'll know somebody. So I come to you and I say, look, I got a problem with my car. Can you recommend a good mechanic? And you say, sure. Take your car over there to John. He'll do you a good job, and he'll charge you a reasonable price. Well, I don't know whether that's true or not. But if I believe you strong enough, I'll take my car over there to John, and sure enough, he does a good job and charges me a reasonable price. When I went there, I believed he would. When I left there, I know that he would. Now, the next time I have a problem with my automobile, I don't ask you or anybody else where to take it. I take it right back to John. Only this time I took it on faith. The first time I took it on belief. Then after certain things happened, I knew, and now I take it back on faith. You can't start with faith. The best you can possibly do is start with belief. Thank God step 2 says we came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. It didn't say we came to know. It didn't say we came to have faith. It said we came to believe. And that's the best we can do in the beginning, is just to believe. If we're an agnostic, we already believe in God. If we're an atheist, we can become willing to believe in God. And we're assured then that we're on the way to the finding of this power, greater than human power. Such a simple idea. Such a simple idea. I lived nearly over 40 years before I ever got this thing figured out, you know. So thank God it's very, very simple, Joe.
Okay, let's go to page 51. If we know this, why and how would we keep this from coming into our life? On page 51, it says, this world of ours had made more material progress in the last century than all the millenniums which went before. Almost everyone knows the reasons. Students of ancient history tell us that the intellect of men in those days was equal to the best of today. Yet in ancient times, material progress was painfully slow. The spirit of modern scientific inquiry, research, and invention was almost unknown. In the realm of material, men's minds were fettered by superstition, tradition, and all sorts of fixed ideas. If you've ever been further up northeast from here, all those little towns up there and those little states up there, those people came over here originally for religious freedom. That's why they came here. And as long as everybody in that area was practicing their religion and somewhat like the others were, the group conscience of the area, if you will, you were okay. But if you had an idea that was different than the group conscience of the area, and you expressed it, what would they do for you? They'd burn you at the stake for being a witch, wouldn't they? So if you had any ideas like that, you'd keep them to yourself. But you see, we have a spiritual liberation from that particular thing. And I used to wonder, why is it that we have televisions and airplanes and cars and all cell phones and all those things? Are we smarter than those people 500 years ago? The answer is no. The intellect of the men in those days was equal to the best of today. So what kept those people in the Dark Ages? Superstition, tradition, and all sorts of fixed ideas kept them in the Dark Ages. Even today, I need an open mind more today than I've ever needed an open mind, because superstition, tradition, and fixed ideas would keep me in the Dark Ages, so to speak. I need an open mind more today than I've ever needed an open mind. I continue to seek with an open mind, and my understanding gets better as time goes by. Not perfect. I don't know anybody, at least I don't know anybody that knows God 100%. You know, I know him better than I did when I started. That's all I can tell you. You see, through the seeking. Because superstition and tradition and old ideas would keep me in the Dark Ages.
Some of the contemporaries of Columbus thought a round earth was preposterous. You know, I think Columbus is one of the greatest examples of what a human being can do based upon belief. And we are pretty well satisfied that Columbus had to be an alcoholic. You know, you got to be stubborn and bullheaded to be able to stand there and express an opinion different than all the rest of the world. In Columbus's days, everybody thought that the world was flat. And Columbus was big enough to say, I don't believe that. He says, I think it's round. You got to be tough to do that. Another reason I think he was alcoholic, he displayed all the mannerisms of an alcoholic. When he left, he didn't know where he was going. When he got there, he didn't know where he was. When he came back, he didn't even know where he had been. But what really made him an alcoholic is a woman financed the whole trip for him.
Twice she did that.
Columbus was able to change basically the map of the world. And based upon what he did and what he experienced, the entire world changed after that. And Columbus followed a little formula.
You want to write down these key words.
Columbus followed a little formula that the world has always known. that if you're going to change anything, period, there's certain things you have to do. And the first thing you have to do, you have to be willing to change. And circumstances are what makes people willing to change. In Columbus's days, they were trying to find a new trade route to the East Indies. The only way they had to go was to sail to the northeast end of the Mediterranean. And then they went by land, and it took literally years to get that to the East Indies and back, camelback, horseback, footback, however they travel. And they were looking for a new trade route. And somebody said, is there any way we could sail a ship to the East Indies? And they said, no, dummy. Don't you know the only thing you can do is sail to the northeast end of the Mediterranean, and then you have to go by land. And they said, well, what if we sailed in the other direction? They said, well, idiot, don't you know the world is flat? And if you sail out there, you're going to sail right off the edge of this sucker, and you're not coming back. Now, I don't know why they believed that. I assume some people sailed out there, didn't come back, and they assumed that they sailed off the edge of it, see? So circumstances trying to find a new trade route is what made old Columbus willing to change his ideas and what he believed. The second thing you got to do to change anything is to believe you can do so. And Columbus said, I believe that this world is round. I don't think it's flat. And he made one of the most drunk statements the world's ever heard. He said, I believe we can get east by sailing west. If that isn't drunk thinking, I don't know what else is. But his belief didn't do him any good, because he's still standing on the shore of the ocean the day he expressed it. Some days, weeks, months, years later, Columbus did the next thing you have to do in order to change anything. He made a decision. He said, by golly, I'm going to go find out whether this thing is round or flat, or whether you can get east by sailing west. But his decision didn't do him any good either, because he's still standing on the shore of the ocean the day he expressed it. Some days, weeks, months, years later, he began to do the next thing you have to do. He began to take action. And he went to the King of Portugal and tried to get the king to finance the trip. And the king said, Columbus, there's no way I'm going to let you have this money. He said, you'll sail out there and sail right off the edge of this sucker, and I'll lose it all. That's why he ended up with the Queen of Spain. Sweet talked her out of the money on the promise that he would bring back gold and silk and spices. She gave him the money, and he took the money and he bought 3 ships. Put provisions in those 3 ships. Put crew members in those 3 ships. They began to go east by sailing west, day after day after day after day, sailing straight west. Now, we don't know for sure, but we have a strong suspicion that on the first trip he hired a special sailor, put him on the bow of the lead ship at night, whispered in his ear, and said, I believe this thing is round, but if you see the edge of this damn thing, you holler so we can get turned around. Now, after sailing straight west day after day after day after day after day, they always got, he got what you always get after the action. He got results. He found land on the other side. Now, we know he thought it was the East Indies. It wasn't. It was the West Indies. But what he had proven to himself is the world is not flat. It is round. You will not sail off the edge of it. He turned right around and came right back to Europe. Went right back to the Queen of Spain. And she said, Columbus, where's the gold, silk, and spices you promised you would bring me? And he said, sweetheart, I'm sorry, I didn't find any. But he said, I'll tell you what, if you'll refinance me, I'll go back. And this time I'll find it.
Trust me, honey.
Trust me, honey. She refinanced him, and he got some more ships and more provisions and more crew members, and he began to go east again by sailing west with one big difference. He didn't hire the special sailor. Put him on the bow of the lead ship at night with a lantern, because you see, he went back in faith. He now knew that the world was round. You can't start with faith. You can only start with belief. And then certain things have to transpire. and then you get the results, and then you can have faith. Now, I'd like to sit here this afternoon and tell you the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous are brand new. The world's never seen anything like them before. But if I did, I'd tell you a lie. Because they're based upon the same set of principles that Columbus and every other human being has ever used to change anything. In order for we alcoholics to recover from alcoholism, the first thing we have to do is to be willing to change. That comes from step 1. When we can see what we're doing is no longer going to work, period. When we're desperate, as only as desperate as the dying can be, we become willing to change. The second thing you have to do is to believe you can do so. And that's step 2. Came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. The third thing you have to do is make a decision. And that's step 3. And the book is going to tell us that step 3 will have little permanent effect unless at once followed by a strenuous course of action. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11 are all action steps. Step 12 gives us the results. Having had a spiritual awakening is the result of these steps. I no longer believe that God will restore me to sanity. I know that He will because He has done so. I now have faith in it. And those of us that have been restored to sanity and we have the faith in this program, then we can go help the next newcomer come to believe. Then they can decide. And then we can take them by the hand and walk with them through the action steps, and they'll have a spiritual awakening, and they'll know, and they can go help the next newcomer come to believe. There's only one thing you and I can't do for the newcomer. We can't make them willing. The willingness, step 1, is a job they have to work on themselves. How does an alcoholic become willing to change? Very simple.
Drink a lot of whiskey.
Drinking whiskey. And if you drink enough of it and you're almost dead from it, then you become willing to change. And when they're willing, then we can help them come to believe, and we can help them decide, and we can help them act. But becoming willing is an inside job they have to do themselves. I had a guy tell me one time, he said, I've been in AA 10 years, and I've been working on step 1 in AA. All that 10 years. And I said, no, you haven't. You don't work on step 1 in AA. You work on step 1 out there drinking whiskey. And then when you get here, then we can help you out. But first, you got to be willing to change and admit you're powerless over alcohol. Your life has become unmanageable. Such a simple little procedure. You know, I thought this finding God was going to be a complicated thing, but it's really not. It's a very, very simple thing. If I know I need God, if I know the beginning of the finding is to believe or be willing to believe, if I know the process necessary to find Him, then I just need to know one more thing. Where am I going to find God? And I think we get here just as confused about where God is as we ever were confused about what God was. I know as a kid growing up in church, I got a picture of God in my mind. I don't know whether I saw it or whether I imagined it. But to me, God was a tall, elderly gentleman standing on a cloud up in the sky. Long, flowing white robe, long, flowing white hair, golden halo around his head, sun rays shooting out of it, and a big stick in his right hand. I think one of the reasons I thought God was there is because I noticed in church when I was a kid going to church that every time the minister talked about God, he always pointed up there. So I knew God had to be up there somewhere. But then what really confused me is I noticed every time the minister wanted to talk to God, he always looked down here. Hell, no wonder we get confused as kids in church, you know. And I looked and I looked and I looked and I never could find God until I came to page 55 in the big book Alcoholics Anonymous, and it tells me just exactly where I'm going to find God.
Years ago, I was working with this halfway house in Tulsa that we started, and a young guy in there asked me if I'd sponsor him. I said, well, sure, be glad to. He said, what would you want me to do? I said, well, first thing you need to do is get out of this halfway house. It's not a very good place to live, basically. And he said, well, it's easy for you to say, I don't have a job. I don't have a car. If I had a car, I could get a job because I'm very well qualified. I said, well, I'll take you back and forth and help you find a job, get you 2 or 3 weeks paychecks, and then we'll get you a car. So that's what we did. But on the way to work one morning, he told me a story that was going to change my life. So all the time I'm helping him, but now he's going to tell me a story that changed my life. And the story went like this. There was these 3 wise men from the east, he told me. And they stole from man and woman the crown of life, the thing that would make us the happiest. And now they took it away from us, and now what are we going to do with it? Well, one of them said, I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll hide it in the highest crevice on the highest mountain on the face of the earth, and they'll never be able to get it there. But the other 2 said, yeah, but you know how they are. They'll hunt and they'll search, and they'll eventually find it. The second one said, I'll tell you what, let's take it to the deepest ocean, put us in the deepest crevice in the deepest ocean. They'll never be able to find it there. But the other 2 said, yeah, but you know how they are. They'll hunt and they'll search it, and they'll eventually find it. The third one said, I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll hide it within himself, and he'll never look for it there. And our book said, yeah, we've been seeing another kind of flight, a spiritual liberation of this world. People who rose above their problems. They said God made these things possible, and we only smiled. We had seen spiritual release, but like to tell ourselves that wasn't true. Actually, we were fooling ourselves, for deep down in every man, woman, and child is a fundamental idea of God. You see, it's just there. Maybe obscured by calamity, by pomp, by worship, by other things, but in some form or other, it's there. For faith in a power greater than ourselves, and miraculous demonstrations of power in human lives are facts as old as man himself. See, we're just born with it. It's just there. We finally saw that faith in some kind of a God was a part of our makeup, just as much as the feeling we have for a friend. Sometimes we had to search fearlessly, but he was there. He was as much a fact as we were. We found the great reality deep down within us. In the last analysis, only there they may be found. And it was so with us. Remember in the explanation of the spiritual experience, he said that inner resource, that's what he's talking about. God is within us, everyone.
You know, we believe today that every human being on earth seems to be born with some form of basic knowledge lying at a subconscious level that seems to be able to tell us what we should do and what we shouldn't do. It seems to be able to tell us how we should live and how we shouldn't live. And I know some people might want to call that common sense. Other people might want to call it innate intelligence. Some might want to call it the conscience. Others might want to call it the soul. Now, I don't think it makes any difference what we call it, as long as we realize it's there. And I know in my own life it's been there as far, far back as I can remember. I used to be getting ready to do something, and this little voice from within me would say, Charlie, I don't really think you ought to be doing this. And I wouldn't pay a bit of attention to it. I'd go ahead and do it, and I'd just get in one hell of a mess. And that same little voice would say, see, I told you not to do it in the first place. Now, if that's God, then I'm 100% convinced that it is. And if God dwells within me, and I know that he does, then that means I've got my own God. I don't worry anymore about whether he's the God of the Baptist church or not. I don't worry about whether he's the God of the Catholic Church, the Hebrew religion, or anybody else's religion. If he dwells within me, he's mine. And he and I can come together in very simple and very understandable terms. This is the greatest piece of information that I have ever learned. I don't have to go find God.
Not lost.
If God's within me, I don't have to go find him. I've just got to uncover the crap that keeps me from seeing God within me. And that's what all the rest of this program is about, to uncover that crap and get rid of it so that the God within me can begin to come to the surface. And this is so simple that every time I think about it, it just blows my mind. I thought this was going to be a complicated procedure. It's not complicated at all. We just have to do a few certain things, and we'll get results, and then we'll know, and then we'll have faith. This thing really does work. Joe?
This sums up this whole chapter, We Agnostics. He said we can only clear the ground a bit if our testimony helps sweep away prejudice, these old ideas, enables you to think honestly. So that's what we're trying to do. Encourage you to search diligently within yourself. Then, if you wish, you can join us on the broad highway. With this attitude, you cannot fail. Now get this. The consciousness of your belief is sure to come to you. You'll have a God of your own understanding that nobody but nobody but nobody could improve upon. The consciousness of your belief is sure to come to you. It's in the seeking. It's not in the finding. It's in the seeking within ourselves, always.
Yeah, I love these recordings. And like I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, where I chose to stop the recording here, they do continue on, closing out the chapter and segueing into chapter 5, how it works. I've already done the edits on that one, and that episode will be out in about a month. I've got a bunch of other episodes coming out in between then, but please look forward to that. To close out this episode, I wanted to read a few emails that we've gotten over the past few weeks, and I'll be reading some YouTube comments and other things on one of the future episodes. So there are a few emails that I wanted to highlight before closing out this episode. And this first one says, Jason, this email is a reaction to having a therapist on the SAA podcast. I like that the podcast, like a meeting, focuses on sex addicts sharing experience, strength, and hope. If the therapist is an SAA member, I'd love to hear their experience, strength, and hope on the podcast. If not, I am cautious. Perhaps this person is an SAA ally and talks about how SAA helps their clients. I'm afraid of being influenced by this person to do recovery their way rather than the 12-step way. But we all need to keep in mind that we have a chapter in the Green Book called Outside Help. Maybe the podcast topic could be an outside help and be appropriate to have this person on. Thank you so much for asking for a group conscience on this topic. I'm looking forward to see what higher power does with this. Thanks, M. And yes, I'm so glad that I got that email. It really helped shape the response that I had. And I will probably be scheduling this guest. And I did write back to the booking agent for this therapist, and I said, thanks so much for writing in and for the guest suggestion. The Sex Addicts Recovery Podcast features stories from sex addicts all around the world. Since this is an official Sex Addicts Anonymous podcast run by the Bay Area Intergroup of SAA, we follow the 12 steps and 12 traditions of SAA. Our focus is on the stories of addicts and the program of SAA. We have guests that occasionally talk about therapy as part of their recovery journey, but they are also members of SAA, and we try to stick to their recovery in the program of SAA. If this guest would be able to talk about his story of recovery in SAA or work with people in the SAA program, please let me know and I can schedule a recording to be a guest on the Sex Addicts Recovery Podcast. Cheers, Jason. And I did get a response. So it sounds like this therapist has been to S programs, including SAA, starting back in 1994. And it sounds like they are open to talking about that on the podcast. And so I'm going to reach out and see if I can book them. And the recording will probably be, it's looking now like April that we're scheduling new guests for. So thank you so much for the feedback. It really helped shape how I was going to reply to this guest. Another one that we got just this past week It says, Jason, I'm a big time listener from San Francisco. Love, love, love the podcast. I'm a teacher and play music on Spotify. I accidentally left my projector on while I was on Spotify, and it showed the word sex addict on the Spotify playlist in front of all my students. I have good relations with my students, and I'm not spinning out about it, but I feel a little bit of a sense of shame. Is there a reason that you put the word sex addict in the title of the podcast and episodes? I guess this is to attract newcomers. Thanks for all you do. Signed, B. And my reply, and I've talked about this here on the podcast a few times, but in my reply, I said, thanks so much for writing in and listening to the podcast. Yes, there's a specific reason for the title, which I will get to shortly, but I totally get you. Occasionally, the podcast thumbnail shows up on YouTube on our TV when my son's been in the room, and sometimes when I'm at work. I quickly try to scroll away with a quick sense of embarrassment as it shows up. It reminds me of leaving the green book lying around on the table in plain sight. Oof. So, the title of the podcast is indeed for Search Engine Optimization, SEO. The original title of the podcast was going to be The Meeting After the Meeting, but it was pointed out that it was very difficult for SEO. So many people on Spotify, YouTube, or Apple Podcasts type in Sex Addicts Anonymous to search for related content. Since the ISO has the copyright on the name Sex Addicts Anonymous, we could not use that in the title, but Sex Addicts hits 2 of the 3 search terms. Additionally, people search for recovery podcasts, and that gives us 2 more of the search terms. If we kept the original title, we would not get so many search hits. So, to answer your question, it is so people searching for these terms will be able to find the podcast. Many listeners have found the program of SAA and meetings by finding the podcast first. And I will be answering this on episode 121 with a couple of other details. Thanks so much for this question, and I hope this helps. Cheers, Jason. And so a couple of the other details that I did want to mention was one of the other titles that we were looking at was the Sex Addiction Recovery Podcast versus Sex Addicts Recovery Podcast. And the reason why we chose Sex Addicts, in addition to having it really close to Sex Addicts Anonymous, is it puts the emphasis on the addict rather than the addiction. So we're not necessarily talking about the addiction, but we're talking about addicts sharing their stories. Hence the name Sex Addicts Recovery Podcast. And yes, I do understand the embarrassment of having that show up. I've looked at a couple of different ways of having a separate player that doesn't have the name. So if people are sensitive, that they could listen to it that way. I've looked into it, but I haven't been able to follow through on that. So that's a possibility in the future. But at least for now, for YouTube, for Spotify, and for Apple Podcasts, it will definitely remain the Sex Addicts Recovery Podcast. That's where a bulk of our searches come from. A couple more quick ones to share, talking about the last few episodes. And the first one comes from our guest, Azar, on episode 119. And it says, I just listened to episode 119 when you had me on. Thank you so much for giving me an opportunity to share my story with you and now anyone who listens. Listening to my own story had an effect on me that I wasn't expecting either. I love what you're doing and hope to connect with you again in the future. Stay sober, Azar. And yes, I look forward to keeping in communication with Azar, and especially since we got another email concerning that episode, and I will be forwarding this on to Azar as soon as I can. And this one says, Hey Jason, I hope you are well. I loved episode 119. Azar's story is so similar to mine with escorts, browsing for escorts, and porn as a substitute. Please feel free to share my email address with Azar. I'd love to connect with him if he is interested. I'm sorry for the loss of a younger family member. That's so difficult. I hope you and your family are doing well. And I'm going to stop right there and pick it up here in a second. Yes, me and my family are doing well. The person that passed away was my cousin once removed, so my cousin's child, who had been incapacitated for the past 10 years due to a brain injury. And it's been very difficult on the family and not unexpected that this would happen, but it was still a very sad loss. And I'm grateful for the family. And we had a celebration of her life, and it was so touching. And with all the friends and family that showed up, it was a great service and a great celebration afterwards, and just lifted our spirits in a time of need. So thank you. Continuing on with the email. I love Ted Lasso. Would you mind sharing the TED podcast that you were referring to in the show? I'd love to listen to it during my next rewatch. If you're interested in hearing a therapist's perspective of each episode, look up My Little Thought Tree on YouTube. He has some great analysis of the episodes and helped a dimwit like me to better understand each episode. So I haven't looked into that yet, but I definitely will. And I will share the podcast that I'm listening to and provide feedback for. I will send that via email. And then to wrap up this email, it says, thanks for the audio slave sample toward the end of episode 119. I miss Chris Cornell, one of many gone too soon. Your podcast is awesome. Thank you for the service in putting together each episode. It is very much appreciated. Signed, R. And you are very welcome. And yeah, I too miss Chris Cornell. But I'm so grateful for all the music that he put out while he was here on Earth. And the last email that I wanted to read came in yesterday and says, hey, Jason. Firstly, thank you so much for your service. I found your podcast indispensable, and it's really helped me in my recovery. Secondly, can you share the details of the noon Zoom? I've heard so much about it, but I can't seem to find the details. I'm in the UK, and an 8 p.m. regular meeting would be useful. And loved the last episode, referring to episode 120. That dude was crazy smart. Yes, he is. And I'm sure he'll get a kick out of hearing that. Very best, signed T. So yes, I will share the information on the noon Zoom room on an upcoming episode that I just recorded. The guest and I were talking about the distinction between there's the Houston noon Zoom room and the noon Zoom room that I go to. And if you look it up on the SAA-recovery.org website, each day of the week has its own title. So it's the Monday Zoom room, the Tuesday Zoom room, etc. Unfortunately, it doesn't have the noon Zoom room in the title, but that's the one that we're referring to. And so it's got information on how to find the Zoom link and password on that. But since you emailed me, I will be able to email you back all the pertinent information for logging in, and look forward to having you there. So again, that one is 7 days a week, and it is a men's and non-binary meeting. So if anyone else is interested in finding that meeting and can't find it on the website, I'd be happy to help you out. And like I had mentioned, I will read some of the YouTube comments that we've had and a few other emails that I may have missed on this episode. I think I got them all, but there may have been one or two that I haven't read. So look forward to that on the next episode. The next few episodes will be from the SAA and COSA speaker meeting. So I have 3 other interviews that I've recorded, and those will follow the SAA and COSA speaker meeting episodes. And then I've got the aforementioned Joe and Charlie talking about step 3 from The Big Book Comes Alive. And for the next few weeks, I will not be scheduling recordings, so I can focus a little bit more time on preparing for the Bay Area retreat. And if anyone is interested in still signing up for that, we have the registrations open until March 10th, and our retreat will be March 15th. So anyone still looking to go, the registration links are open as I am recording this and posting this. So if you did want to provide feedback, like the ones that I had just read here on the podcast, you can reach us at feedback@sexaddictsrecoverypod.com. If you wanted to get a hold of me personally, you can reach me at jason@sexaddictsrecoverypod.com. And with that, I will close out this episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. And as always, keep coming back. The views and opinions contained in the Sex Addicts Recovery Podcast are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the Bay Area Intergroup or the ISO of SAA.